For centuries, complex systems have followed a familiar rhythm. They expand, integrate, and grow confident in their own permanence. Wealth accumulates, trade deepens, institutions thicken, distance shrinks. And then, quietly at first, the foundations begin to shift. Not because of villains or accidents, but because the structure itself has reached a point where it can no longer sustain the incentives that built it. In the late 19th century, the world experienced one of the most interconnected eras in human history. Capital moved freely across borders. Currencies were linked by shared standards. Supply chains stretched across continents by rail and steamship. Financial centers believed they had engineered stability into the system itself. War between major powers was widely viewed as irrational, economically impossible, and therefore obsolete. The system was too advanced to fail, too interdependent to fracture, too wealthy to destroy itself. That confidence was sincere. It was also wrong. What followed was not an abrupt collapse, but a sequence. Economic strain appeared first, disguised as prosperity. Debt expanded faster than production. Financial instruments grew more complex as returns became harder to earn. Political commitments multiplied without corresponding resources. Strategic guarantees were issued cheaply because their true cost had not yet arrived. Risk accumulated, but it was distributed so widely that no single institution felt responsible for containing it. By the time violence erupted, the decision-makers involved did not believe they were choosing catastrophe. They believed they were managing it. Each move was framed as defensive. Each escalation justified by the previous one. Each participant convinced that the system itself would prevent total breakdown. It did not. The machinery of integration, once stressed, became the machinery of mobilization. This is the pattern history records with unsettling consistency. Periods of deep financial integration lower perceived risk while increasing actual fragility. Economic imbalances create political pressure. Political pressure produces security commitments. Security commitments harden into alliances. And when confidence in the economic order weakens, the incentives governing those alliances change rapidly. What once restrained conflict begins to accelerate it. The danger is never announced. It does not arrive with panic. It arrives with normalization. Markets continue to function. Institutions remain open. Leaders speak in calibrated language. Daily life feels intact. And beneath it all, the system transitions from growth to preservation, from cooperation to positioning, from trust to contingency. In every age where this pattern appears, participants believe they are witnessing something unprecedented. They are not. They are inhabiting a late stage of a cycle that has always ended the same way. The most dangerous moment is not collapse itself, but the period when collapse becomes unavoidable and no one is yet willing to admit it. Systemic collapse does not resemble the dramatic endings people imagine. There are no singular moments where stability vanishes overnight. Instead, collapse unfolds as a process that feels, for a long time, like continuity. The surface remains familiar even as the underlying mechanics degrade. What ultimately fails is not a government or a currency, but the incentive structure that once aligned behavior across the system. Large-scale systems always begin with productive expansion. Capital investment generates real output. Trade widens access to resources. Institutions form to manage complexity. Over time, success breeds layers. Financial claims multiply faster than physical production. Debt grows not as an emergency measure, but as a default operating condition. Future growth is pulled forward to sustain present expectations. At this stage, the system still appears healthy. Asset prices rise, consumption expands, confidence becomes self-reinforcing. But beneath this apparent strength, productivity growth slows, returns on investment compress. To maintain momentum, policymakers and financial actors introduce distortions, monetary expansion, regulatory exemptions, Financial engineering. These measures are framed as stabilization, but their true function is delay. Collapse typically progresses through a recognizable sequence. First comes financial saturation, when debt grows faster than income and leverage replaces productivity as the primary driver of growth. Next is monetary distortion, where currency and credit are manipulated to preserve confidence rather than reflect reality. This leads to incentive decay. Risk-taking is rewarded. Prudence is penalized. Discipline erodes, not through corruption alone, but through rational adaptation to the new rules. As imbalances widen, social strain follows. Wealth concentrates where financial access exists, while productive capacity stagnates elsewhere. The system continues to circulate money, but less of it translates into durable value. Public trust weakens, not suddenly, but selectively. Confidence remains in markets and institutions until it doesn't. The critical phase is political entanglement. Economic stress demands intervention. Intervention creates dependencies. Dependencies generate obligations. Fiscal promises expand faster than the capacity to honor them. At this point, collapse becomes slow but irreversible. Each corrective action deepens reliance on the very mechanisms causing the imbalance. The final stage is externalization. When internal adjustments are no longer sufficient, pressure is redirected outward. Trade conflicts intensify, currency systems fracture, security commitments harden, economic weakness begins to translate into strategic anxiety. The system does not seek war, but it becomes structurally more tolerant of it. Throughout this process, participants mistake motion for health. Activity continues. Transactions occur. Growth appears in nominal terms. But the system has shifted from value creation to value extraction. Wealth moves through the structure faster than it can be retained within it. This pattern has appeared across centuries, under monarchies and republics, gold standards and fiat systems, empires and alliances. The names change, the technologies differ, the incentives do not. To see how this sequence plays out in practice, it is necessary to step backward into an earlier world that once believed itself uniquely stable, rational, and immune to historical gravity. In the 1st century of the Roman Empire, the system appeared unassailable. Rome commanded the Mediterranean economy, controlled the dominant trade routes, and enforced a unified legal framework that allowed capital, labor, and goods to circulate with unprecedented efficiency. Its currency was trusted, its military unmatched. Its administrative reach extended farther than any prior state in recorded history. Wealth flowed continuously into the imperial core, extracted from provinces through taxation, tribute, and trade. This dominance rested on real structural advantages. Roman roads reduced transaction costs. Standardized law lowered commercial risk. A professional army secured borders and guaranteed internal stability. For generations, expansion financed the system itself. New territories brought fresh resources, new taxpayers, and additional labor. The empire's obligations were funded by growth rather than debt. But expansion eventually encountered limits. Once borders stabilized, Rome's inflows slowed while its commitments remained fixed. The military, once an investment that generated returns, became a permanent expense. Administrative complexity increased. Maintaining order across vast distances required more personnel, more spending, and more coordination. Productivity in the core provinces stagnated, even as consumption expectations remained high. To bridge the gap, Rome turned to monetary distortion. Silver content in the denarius was gradually reduced. Currency volume increased to meet fiscal needs without raising politically dangerous taxes. In the short term, this preserved stability. Soldiers were paid. Trade continued. Markets functioned. But the real value circulating through the system declined. Prices rose unevenly. Trust in money weakened, first quietly, then openly. As incentives shifted, behavior followed. Productive investment declined. Hoarding replaced enterprise. Wealth flowed toward political proximity rather than economic utility. Provincial extraction intensified, accelerating depopulation and underinvestment at the edges of the empire. Rome remained wealthy on paper, but that wealth moved through the system without rebuilding its foundations. Social consequences followed predictable lines. Inequality widened. The urban population became increasingly dependent on state distributions. The rural economy fragmented. Military loyalty shifted from the state to individual commanders who could guarantee payment. The empire did not collapse in a single moment. It thinned. Authority decentralized. Cohesion weakened. When external pressures intensified, migration, border incursions, resource shocks, Rome lacked the fiscal flexibility and institutional trust required to respond effectively. Its military strength remained formidable, but it was no longer sustainably financed. The system that once converted power into stability now converted stress into fragmentation. Rome did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because its internal economic logic could no longer support its external commitments. Wealth still circulated, but it no longer stayed. This was not viewed by contemporaries as inevitable decline. Each reform was presented as restoration, each debasement as temporary, each emergency measure as exceptional. The pattern was invisible to those inside it. A similar conviction would later emerge in a very different society, under vastly different technologies, but guided by the same belief, that complexity itself had abolished historical limits. In early 20th century Europe, the prevailing belief was not imperial permanence, but civilizational maturity. The major powers of the continent had not merely accumulated wealth, they had engineered a system designed to prevent catastrophic conflict. Capital markets were deeply integrated. London financed railways in Russia. German industry depended on British insurance. French savings flowed across borders through bonds and banks. The gold standard linked currencies into a shared monetary discipline that appeared to remove political discretion from finance itself. This integration produced confidence bordering on certainty. Economic interdependence was assumed to make large-scale war irrational. The costs would be too high, the incentives too misaligned. Political leaders, financiers, and industrialists believed that even if crises emerged, they would be contained by the sheer density of economic ties. The system was not merely prosperous, it was presumed self-correcting. Beneath that confidence, familiar distortions accumulated. Industrial output expanded rapidly, but returns were increasingly uneven. Germany's productive capacity surged faster than its access to global capital and resources. Britain's financial dominance masked declining industrial competitiveness. France relied heavily on external lending to sustain domestic stability. Debt obligations, military expenditures, and social promises grew in parallel, each justified by continued growth that had not yet been tested. The belief that this time is different was reinforced by recent experience. The late 19th century had been remarkably peaceful by European standards. Crises occurred, but they were resolved through conferences, guarantees, and financial coordination. Each successful containment strengthened faith in the system's resilience. Risk was not eliminated. It was normalized. When strain emerged, it did so economically first. Capital flows became more volatile. Arms spending increased even as fiscal flexibility narrowed. Alliances hardened in response to perceived insecurity, not aggression. Strategic commitments were made under the assumption that they would deter escalation rather than enable it. The triggering event in 1914 did not cause collapse on its own. It activated a system already primed for rapid failure. Financial markets froze almost instantly. Gold convertibility was suspended. Governments abandoned monetary discipline in favor of survival. Economic integration, once a stabilizing force, became a transmission mechanism for panic and mobilization. What followed was not a failure of diplomacy alone, but of incentives. The economic order that had promised restraint instead accelerated commitment. Once confidence in the system's continuity broke, preserving position mattered more than preserving integration. States moved not because they desired war, but because delay appeared more dangerous than action. The aftermath revealed the depth of the miscalculation. Wealth was destroyed on a scale previously unimaginable. Empires dissolved. Currencies collapsed. Social contracts were rewritten under duress. The system that had seemed too interconnected to fail proved instead to be exquisitely fragile. The stages of collapse unfolded exactly as before: financial strain, monetary distortion, political entanglement, externalization. The technologies were new. The rhetoric was modern. The pattern was ancient. To understand why this matters now, it is necessary to look not at personalities or policies, but at the structure of the present system and the incentives quietly reshaping it. The modern global system rests on a similar foundation of confidence, complexity, and integration. It is not defined by ideology, but by incentives. Capital moves at digital speed. Supply chains span continents. Financial markets operate continuously, pricing risk with mathematical precision. Institutions coordinate across borders with a level of technical sophistication unmatched in history. On the surface, the system appears resilient by design, yet the same structural pressures are present. Debt has become the primary mechanism for sustaining growth across governments, corporations, and households. Productivity gains, while real in certain sectors, no longer scale evenly across the system. To compensate, monetary expansion fills the gap between what the economy produces and what it promises. This is not framed as distortion, but as necessity. Stability must be preserved. Confidence must be maintained. Over time, this changes behavior. Financial returns become increasingly detached from underlying output. Asset values rise faster than wages. Consumption is sustained by credit rather than income growth. Risk is redistributed through complex instruments that obscure rather than eliminate exposure. The system remains liquid, but less solvent. It continues to function, but with declining tolerance for shock. As incentives weaken internally, external commitments grow heavier. Security guarantees expand. Trade dependencies harden into strategic vulnerabilities. Economic leverage becomes a tool of policy. Sanctions, tariffs, and currency pressures are used not as last resorts, but as routine instruments. Each measure is rational in isolation. Collectively, they tighten the system's margins. The defining characteristic of late-stage systems is not dysfunction, but sensitivity. Small disruptions produce disproportionate effects. Supply interruptions cascade. Financial stress migrates rapidly across markets. Political decisions taken for domestic stability carry international consequences. No single actor controls the outcome, yet every actor responds to the same underlying pressures. Crucially, the system does not fail because participants intend harm. It fails because the incentive to preserve position overtakes the incentive to preserve structure. When confidence in future stability weakens, optionality becomes paramount. States, institutions, and firms begin to plan not for optimization, but for survivability. Cooperation persists rhetorically, while contingency planning accelerates quietly. This is the modern parallel to earlier moments in history. Not a repetition of events, but of dynamics. High integration combined with high leverage. Monetary flexibility replacing structural reform. Strategic commitments layered atop economic fragility. A shared belief that collapse would be too costly to allow, until the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the cost of abandoning it. At that point, systems do not announce their transition, they simply enter a new phase. One where stability feels intact, even as deterioration accelerates beneath it. one where warnings are plentiful but consensus is absent. And it is in this phase, when everything still appears to be working, that the pace of change becomes most dangerous. Late-stage systems are defined by an unsettling contradiction. They feel stable precisely when they are least adaptable. The architecture is mature, the institutions are experienced, the procedures are rehearsed, risk models are calibrated to past behavior, not emerging reality. What is interpreted as resilience is often rigidity. As pressures mount, institutions respond by narrowing their field of vision. Anomalies are treated as temporary. Deviations are explained away as noise. Warnings that fall outside accepted frameworks are dismissed not because they are wrong, but because they are disruptive. Stability becomes a narrative to be defended rather than a condition to be measured. This is where acceleration begins, not through panic, but through normalization. Extraordinary measures become routine. Emergency tools are absorbed into standard policy. Balance sheets expand. Commitments are rolled forward. Each intervention reduces immediate stress while increasing long-term fragility. The system learns that it can postpone consequences, and so it does, repeatedly. Narrative control plays a critical role. Language shifts subtly. Fragility is reframed as transition. Volatility becomes adjustment. Structural imbalance is described as transformation. These narratives are not cynical fabrications. They are coping mechanisms that allow complex systems to function under strain without triggering self-defeating reactions. At the same time, risk tolerance rises. Behaviors that would once have been unacceptable become necessary. Leverage increases because deleveraging would cause immediate damage. Strategic ambiguity replaces clarity because firm commitments limit flexibility. Each actor adapts rationally to constraints that no one actor created. The result is compression. Economic, political, and security domains become tightly coupled. A financial shock becomes a diplomatic incident. A trade dispute carries military implications. A regional conflict affects global markets within hours. The system loses slack. There is no longer space to absorb error. Warnings, when they appear, are interpreted through institutional filters designed for a different era. Historical analogies are rejected as irrelevant. Models assume continuity because discontinuity cannot be priced. By the time evidence becomes undeniable, the range of available responses has narrowed dramatically. Acceleration does not mean chaos. It means speed. Decisions must be made faster, with less information, under greater pressure. In such conditions, preserving credibility often outweighs preserving structure. Actors move to avoid appearing weak, unreliable, or unprepared. Deterrence postures harden. Commitments are reaffirmed. Lines are drawn more clearly, not because certainty has increased, but because ambiguity has become intolerable. This is the stage where systems feel most alive. Markets are active. Institutions are engaged, leaders speak constantly. And yet beneath the activity, optionality is vanishing. History shows that once a system enters this phase, outcomes are shaped less by intention than by momentum. The question is no longer whether strain exists, but how it will be resolved. And resolution, in such systems, has never arrived gently. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because incentives outlast memory. Each generation inherits structures built for earlier conditions and adapts them as long as adaptation is easier than reform. When reform becomes too costly, behavior changes instead, not out of malice, but out of alignment with what the system rewards. Large systems encourage short-term stabilization over long-term resilience. Leaders are not irrational when they defer pain. Institutions are not corrupt when they preserve continuity. Markets are not delusional when they price the present more heavily than the future. These responses are logical within the constraints imposed by scale, complexity, and competition. The tragedy is not that warning signs are ignored, but that they are absorbed. Systems learn to live with imbalance. They normalize fragility. They treat survival as success. Over time, this reshapes expectations. What once would have demanded correction becomes background condition. What once appeared unsustainable becomes familiar. Human behavior follows incentives more reliably than ideals. When expansion is rewarded, systems expand. When leverage is rewarded, systems lever. When externalizing risk preserves internal stability, risk is externalized. Conflict, in this context, is not a goal. It is a byproduct of competing preservation strategies within a constrained environment. The pattern that preceded 1914 was not unique to that era. It was the product of a world that had grown too interconnected to fail gently. Economic strain hardened political commitments. Political commitments narrowed strategic flexibility. Strategic rigidity turned shocks into catalysts. Once the system crossed that threshold, no single decision caused catastrophe. Momentum did. This is why periods of apparent calm before major ruptures feel deceptive in retrospect. The indicators were visible. The data existed. The institutions functioned. What was missing was not intelligence, but adaptability. The cost of changing course had already surpassed the cost of staying on it. Cycles persist because they are built into the way large systems evolve. Growth creates complexity. Complexity creates fragility. Fragility incentivizes control. Control reduces adaptability. And reduced adaptability ensures that when disruption arrives, it propagates rather than dissipates. History does not require villains to produce tragedy. It requires only alignment between incentives and scale. When systems reach a point where preserving position matters more than preserving structure, outcomes become increasingly constrained. The range of peaceful adjustments narrows. The tolerance for shock disappears. Understanding this does not grant immunity. Awareness does not dissolve incentives. But it does offer clarity. Not reassurance and not prediction, but perspective. The recognition that moments which feel unprecedented are often deeply familiar to history. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.